So this morning I'm going to show you how to do a graduated wash, and we're going to have a little play with some cloud shapes within that wash prior to putting down the landscape. So I'm going to use this photograph, but I'm only going to be loosely inspired by it. So put that to one side. So the first thing is to prepare my wash. I have already sorted some colours. They're not totally sorted, so I'm going to just make sure they're what I want. So I'm going to start with Phthalo Cyanine Turquoise, Phthalo Turquoise, and that's the wash I've got at the moment, that colour. That should be okay. And the next one is Cobalt Blue, which is a nice strong Cobalt Blue, so I can get some nice dramatic cloud shapes appearing within it. And then this mixture is a mixture of those two blues, so it's simply a mixture of the Phthalo Turquoise and the Cobalt Blue. And it's a little bit more dilute than my main Cobalt Blue mix. So those are my mixtures. So the first thing I want to do is wet the surface of the area of paper that I want to use. So for a graduated wash, I need the paper to be moist. So I'm going to wet an area. I'm using a hake brush, a 2-inch hake, which is a good type of brush for covering the surface. And I want that surface water to be as even as I can make it. So just even it out. And it's quite important to let that water have time to be absorbed by the paper. If the paper is damp, if the fibres of the paper are damp, they'll hold the water a little bit longer. You have a little bit more time to work on a moist surface. And a moist surface for a wash is going to help to spread the colours softly, so that you get a more gradual rainbow effect of colours. So I'm just going to leave that for a moment or two. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to take a little bit of that surface water off. There's a little bit too much there at the moment. It will cause my pigment to run down quite rapidly down the surface of the wet area once I've angled my board. So I just want to even that out and make sure there isn't too much surface water there to make my colours run too fast. So, yeah, okay, that looks all right. So the next thing is to angle my board to about 30 degrees. I'm putting it on a pencil case. That should be all right, I think. Something like that. And I'm going to get my 1-inch hake, which I'm pre-wetting with clean water, because it's amazing how absorbent the hairs of a large brush are. And if you dip, it makes a big difference if you dip a damp brush into your paint you'll absorb less of the paint. And if you dip a very dry brush in, you'll find it will absorb rather a lot. So I'm just going to go for it with this wash. Because my phthalo turquoise. And I'm going to immediately go around to my mixture. Just trying to wander down too far. Capture that a little bit. See how the moist surface of the paper encourages the paint to run down. And then I'm going to add a little bit of cobalt blue to that mixture and take that across. One of those. Sure those are bits of grease on the paper perhaps. We'll carry on, they might fortuitously make us some little clouds, mightn't they? Intriguing little spots appearing. It's always a new experience with watercolour painting. Oh, they're evening themselves out, that's interesting. So I'm looking for this little reservoir. I'm taking my time, taking the paint down at an even pace, trying to keep the movement of the pigment gradual and even as I go down. Ending up with this nice strong cobalt blue wash. Right, down. And now I'm going to take the excess paint out of my brush. I'm waiting for the paint to settle. It's moving continuously down my board and it's gathering at the bottom. And that's what I want because that's evening out the colour. And the granulating nature of cobalt blue is already evident in the way the paint is settling. So to get rid of this extra paint here, to prevent it from making a back run at the top of my picture, I've taken the excess out of my brush and I'm now just going to soak up that reservoir, unwanted reservoir at the bottom. So I'm taking my brush slowly along there and giving the pigment time to be sucked back up into the hairs of the brush. Okay, so if I wanted a nice flat mellifluous wash, I've got one. So I could use a hairdryer on that to speed up the drying process and then get on with putting my landscape on over it. As I want to play with the wash a little bit, I have to wait until that's the right degree of dampness. Now, I think you can see it's quite wet, especially at the bottom part, and it's starting to dry at the top. And if I keep it angled, the moisture is continuing to drain downwards, and so the bottom part, or what will be the bottom part of the painting, will dry before the top part. So there's nothing wrong with that happening, but it all takes a little time, and whilst the paint is very wet, any additional paint you put into it will travel a long way. So what I'm going to do for the sake of the demo is I'm going to now put this flat, and I will start to try pulling out one or two shapes from it. You've seen how damp it is, quite shiny. Let's see how it's doing actually. Things happen quite quickly, especially on a dry day such as I have today here in southwest England. So it's still quite shiny. It's starting to become less so. Now, if I want to pull out some little white fluffy clouds, that's quite a simple operation. I can take a bit of kitchen towel and crumple it a little bit and simply dab, and little cloud shapes will appear. The thing about those little cloud shapes is that they will tend to close up again. You may be able to see that happening. The water's always moving until it's dry. Everything's moving. Pigment will move with where the water goes, obviously. And shapes made into a very wet surface will tend to close again if they can. The water's always trying to reach kind of even level. It's always trying to sort of become calm, smooth, like the surface of a lake. It's always seeking rest. So it will seek rest until such time as it's already all evaporated into the air. It'll seek rest on the paper. So it's almost as if I'm looking into a hot sky and I can see a little cloud and I can see it evaporating in the heat of the day. But at a certain point, that will stop and my cloud shape will be there. But if you want it to be more than that, just continue to look after it, and you can make it any shape you want. You can add a few more as you go. It's starting to dry more now, so actually the movement of the pigment is less. Already I'm starting to be able to take out my shapes, and they'll probably not move that much. I think I'm losing some detail up there. It is still slowly moving, but less. So that's one way that you can take out a lovely little diaphanous cloud. Another way, use my number 12 round. I'm going to pre-damp it because a damp brush is more absorbent actually than the dry hairs of a brush. So if I want to do some clouds in stripes, perhaps lower down on the horizon, I can use my damped but not very wet brush to pull out some of the pigment as it's drying. So I'm pressing down onto the heel of my brush for this and just pulling out some pigment. So that's forming a little row of clouds a bit further back in the picture space. It's quite subtle, and if I want to improve on that, as it were, I can get my brush with a little bit more water and I can tickle the surface with the tip of the brush and then carefully dab out, and it will come whiter. So as the rest of the surface is already still damp, it's probably best to only dab where you actually want to remove more of the pigment. So that's coming out a little bit whiter. And obviously you can play around with the shapes however you want. So yeah, so I'm looking at these clouds and they are still a little bit blue and soft, and maybe I want a little bit more white there too, so I'm going to kind of just encourage that a little bit as well. Tickle out a little bit more strength in the contrast there. But in so doing, you lose the delicacy. So it's a kind of, it's a trade-off. I'm getting back to white paper, but the wonderful delicacy of the pulled out mark is perhaps less subtle. So, okay, so I can go on doing a bit more of this, and I'll show you just dropping back in. This is starting to dry quite a lot now, so I've added more water there to remove more pigment. And as I have, let's see, it's not really shining there. It's still damp, very much so. pigment is still loose, and still paper is still damp. So that's going to have, if I put water on that and leave it, you'll find that's a good way of getting a background. In fact, you can see one just starting to form perhaps along here. And if I, for instance, wanted to have a stronger cloud now up here at the top, I'm now inventing, if I played with this with moisture on my brush and no pigment, if I put a mark in, or two maybe, you can see how that moisture will behave. In fact, it's drying quite a bit up there as well, isn't it? Yep, it's still damp, but the heaviness of the pigment, there's a little bit more moisture just to move that pigment there. And take it off. There we are. So now I've taken that off with water, but I've left some water there, and we'll see how that now behaves. That's going to behave very differently. It takes time in watercolour for the effects to really ripen, and I hope, as I talk, you can see the effects of those 2 or 3 brush marks ripening in the damp wash. And what is happening is I have removed some of the pigment with my brush, but other pigment I've loosened, and because of the extra water, all the pigment I've loosened is moving. It's all on the move. And so what tends to happen with pigment is it's attracted to the edge, to the meniscus of the edge of the shape of the water. You'll notice that if you do a big amount of wet work on a dry surface as well, that also happens. But it happens on this damp surface, and that's what starts to give you the back run. Some artists really love back runs and toucultivate them in their work, and some artists try to avoid them. This is very much a personal thing. But I think the value of an exercise like this is knowing how they're formed, how you can get them, and how you can avoid them if you don't want them. So this is probably still quite damp. It's cold to the touch. So I know there's still some moisture there. For instance, this is a warm sensation here, but here it's quite cold. So if I want to put colour into that, let's say, for instance, I get a little bit of permanent rose and a little bit of my phthalo together, makes a kind of a murky colour, just for the sake of colour. And if I wanted to, say, add some pigment to that, maybe slightly clouds go down on the horizon, for instance, adding a little more water to that mix now and diluting it, but not too much because I don't want too much water on the paper. Remember the principle of more pigment and less water. So then I can just add a little bit of coloration to those clouds, and it's already moving, you can see. So down here I'm kind of cultivating that movement by just adding, I'm using the tummy of my brush in a way to just spread it a little bit, and I could leave it like that and just see what happens. So here it's almost dry, it's not moving too much now, so really this colour might even sort of stay put quite well. But if it's damper, for instance, if I was to go up here, it's also quite dry there. So it's an experiment to see where it's dry. Where it's dry, it won't move. Excuse me. But where it is wetter, for instance, it's probably still wet here, colour will still move. Okay. And that colour and water that I've added there is another wave, if you like, of movement added to the first wave of movement. So you can see how that's going. It's moving in different directions from the first wave because the drying process has already taken hold on the first wave. but there's quite a lot of water there, and all the moisture is moving out and giving me a strong background. So if I again add more watery moisture to this, I'll get more backgrounds forming, probably. Sometimes if you want them, you don't get them. You see. So I'm adding more. This is quite a wet mixture, but if I use the same colours, so permanent rose and turquoise, that's giving me quite a dark mixture, which I don't actually want because it's a diaphanous, lovely, light-filled subject. So I'm going to make it thinner with a little bit of Chinese white, or paler, a little bit of moisture just to keep it working, and add some Chinese white. So I've got a pale mauve. It's now a little bit opaque, semi-opaque. But if I put that down here, that may well behave differently from the first application, the other end. So that should behave differently because it will the paint moves slower in the wash. And indeed, this paint has now filled that area, but this paint is moving only partly into it. So I had a little play, and I've tried a few things out on my graduated wash, some of them influenced by my photo, and some just trying out one or two of these different things, these different points of more pigment, less water, more water, less pigment, and then going back in with watery washes or not, or just pulling out. So there are various things you can try to practice cloud forms in a graduated wash.